Welcome to another episode of Call to the Bar, International Law over Drinks. My name is Douglas Guilfoyle and I'm Professor of International Law and Security at UNSW Canberra. We have something a little different this week. In April this year, the ANU Law School hosted a one-day workshop on Australia's history of involvement with the UN Security Council. First up, we have an interview between my co-host, Associate Professor Imogen Saunders, and the workshop convener, Professor Jeremy Farrall. Then we have a number of mini-interviews with some of the participants. I hope you find it interesting. Okay, let's get on with the episode.
This is Imogen Saunders sitting with Professor Jeremy Farrall. Now, Jeremy was one of the organisers of the Australia's relationship with the UN Security Council workshop that we hosted the Roadshow at last week. And I've taken this opportunity to chat to Jeremy about the workshop, and he's going to share his reflections on the process. But before we start, Jeremy, it's your first time on the podcast. Could you give the listeners a brief summation of who you are and the work you do?
Well, thanks, Imogen. And first, what a pleasure to be on the podcast. You guys are doing such great work with all of your fantastic podcast recordings. I am a professor of law at ANU Law School, and my area of expertise is really international law and the UN Security Council and the decision-making processes of the Security Council and the various dilemmas that we face in relation to the primary purpose of the UN Security Council, which is to maintain international peace and security. And this workshop came about basically at the suggestion of the general editors of the Australian Yearbook of International Law, and it's their plan to run a special edition on a really important topic each year for the next 5 years or so. And the first topic was decided to be this idea of Australia's relationship with the UN Security Council, because 2026 marks the 80th anniversary of that institution. Its inaugural meeting was held in January 1946, and in fact Australia was on that inaugural UN Security Council, and because of the way the presidency rotates, it was the very first ever president of the UN Security Council, because we were the first in the English-speaking alphabet. So this workshop, the idea of the workshop is really to draw together a range of experts, so both academic and practitioner experts, on Australia's relationship with the UN Security Council, so the history of Australia's contributions, what's happening at the moment and where we're moving.
And I think one of the things that strikes me about your academic career, looking from the outside, is you do have this very close relationship with government and practitioners, probably in part because of your own history working for the United Nations, as well as being an academic. And I think this was a real strength of the workshop, that it had that combination of academic and government participants. Obviously, the workshop was under Chatham House rules, so we can't talk specifically about necessarily who was there or what they said. But was that something that you were really, motivated to make sure happened when you invited the speakers for it?
Yes, absolutely. So we really wanted to bring together a blend of the academics and the practitioners, and also academics who have practical experience and practitioners who have academic qualifications, just because we think that it's so important for a workshop to have impact, both academically and in practice. You need to have this mix of contributors at the table. And we were very lucky. We issued a call for papers to secure as wide a blend of contributors as possible. And we've ended up with a really terrific combination at this workshop. And we had 4 panels, and each of the panels was really terrifically interesting. And we're hopeful that as follow-up from this workshop, we'll have a really terrific collection of papers that will then go through peer review and be published in the yearbook early next year.
And as well as organising the workshop, you did also present. Would you like to just tell our listeners a little bit about the project that you presented at the workshop?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. I mean, I should mention that I wasn't initially supposed to be presenting. I was supposed to be one of my terrific colleagues and collaborators on a project which is called Leveraging Power and Influence on the UN Security Council, the role of elected members. And that colleague is Dr. Jenny Whalen, who currently holds a policy role at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. But she and I have been part of a long-term project looking at, what difference do elected members make and how do they leverage and exercise influence, leverage power and exercise influence. And as part of this project, we've come up with this framework of elected member influence, and so my paper was sharing this framework, and then other colleagues during the course of the workshop, later in the workshop, then went and applied the framework in relation to their papers. So that includes Professor Jochen Prantl in his paper later in the day, and Professor Chris Michelson as well. Sorry. Should I talk about the framework? Okay, yeah. So the framework, really, we call it the SCAN. So SCAN stands for Security Council Analysis Network, which is an organisation of, or a network of about half a dozen scholars who we came together when Australia was last on the UN Security Council in 2014, to analyse not just Australia's contributions, but also what was going on in the Security Council so that we could inform, I guess, the public more broadly in terms of what was taking place and Australia's role in what was taking place. And we engaged in a bit of media. We wrote various academic pieces during the course of those 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, we thought it'd be really great to keep working on these issues together. And we pitched a project to the Australian Research Council and got funding for a discovery project on that theme of leveraging power and influence on the council, the role of elected members. And as part of our fieldwork for that process and part of our analysis, we came up, we're basically looking for examples where elected member states had been able to exercise influence despite the fact that they don't have the power of the veto and they're just on the council for a temporary period of 2 years. Of course, the major assumption in the literature is always that it's the P5 who are the be-all and end-all when it comes to the Security Council. So they decide and then the elected members just have to fall in line. And that's actually been quite an accurate description of dynamics for a long time in the Security Council. But we felt that there was a broader and more interesting story to be told about, precisely when, despite the fact that they had very little power, elected members have been able to make a difference on the council. And so we looked at various case studies and we've met with a range of elected member delegations over the years in New York, and we've identified some really interesting cases of influence, and on the basis of that we've looked at how those cases came about, and that's where this framework comes from. So let me talk about the framework. Sorry, a very long-winded introduction. So the framework looks at these key elements in terms of exercising influence, and we've referred to them as the assets of influence and the pathways of influence. And so the assets are, I guess, they're qualities or capacities that an elected member can actually work on and maximise in order to develop influence. And then the pathways are basically steps that they can take or modes they can move into in order to employ those assets to have an influential impact. So there are 3 key assets of influence, and we refer to them as the 3 C's. So it's capacity, credibility, and conditions. So in terms of capacity, we look at the diplomatic capacities and competencies of elected members. And one way to think about this is the resources that they have at their disposal. And that can be both financial resources, so the more funding that an elected member state devotes to its time on the council and to developing the expertise that's necessary and the skill sets that are necessary the more financial resources available, the more human resources available, and also if you like, the moral, political resources as well, then the more likely they are to be able to exercise influence. And some examples of this might be increasing the budget that's dedicated both to the delegation in New York, or to the machinery that supports the delegation from capital. So it might be a matter of extra dollars, the human resources. It might be a matter of recruiting additional members of the delegation in New York. So some elected members over the years have actually doubled the size of their footprint in New York during the time of their membership. Yeah, so I think obviously financial and human resources are the key examples of assets. It can also be a question, and this is interrelated to that, but of the diplomatic footprint that an elected member has, not just in New York or in capital, but elsewhere throughout the world. So an example where you might have really terrific assets is if you have very effective diplomatic representation in the permanent 5 capitals. So you've got good relations and intelligence coming from there, but also because the Security Council's activities are so it's so invested in maintaining peace and security through the African continent. The larger we've identified that the larger presence an elected member has in Africa, the more influential they'll obviously be on issues relating to peace operations that are deployed throughout Africa. So that's the assets. Credibility relates to, if you like, the legitimacy and the principled nature of an elected member's stance on particular issues. So if you have a history of contributing generously to peace operations, and you've got a number of individuals that have been senior officials on those operations, then you'll have greater credibility on the issues relating to peace operations, and therefore a greater influence in the policy directions that the council takes on peace operations. So that's credibility, and obviously it also relates to constituencies. So for instance, for Australia, looking to be on the council next in 2029, 2030, we obviously would look to show what our principles are, but then also who we're seeking to represent. And an example of that, so one principle might be this idea of climate change, and that as a security issue, given the extent of damage that flows from climate change. And an obvious constituency would be small island developing states, I guess, and those that are in our region in the Pacific. And also potentially, if we were to to take a stance on this issue, then we'd have a broader constituency in the Caribbean or wherever you have small island states. So that's credibility. The third one, and both the capacity and the credibility, you have control over as an elected member. You can increase your investment in the human and financial resources that support your efforts and your networks, etc. You can work on the areas of principle, you can build a record and be seen as a credible actor on those issues. But the third component is conditions, and so this really relates to the favourability of conditions. And in the Security Council, this is really critical, because obviously if you have a permanent member that wants to veto on an issue, then you might have to wait for a change in those geopolitical conditions in order to exercise influence on a particular issue. Sorry.
No.
Imogen, it's a really long-winded.
That was great. So you've gone through assets, but you said there was also pathways. So I might get you to briefly set through pathways. Then I have a question without notice for you.
Oh, okay, interesting. So the 3 pathways that we've identified, the first is agenda setting, the second is solution brokering, and the third is outcome shaping. So agenda setting is when elected members seek to create new so to focus on a new issue. This often might take place when they're adding a thematic item to the agenda. So an example of a thematic agenda item is women, peace and security, which Namibia added to the agenda in 1999 as an elected member. So that's agenda setting, but we refer to that as either setting the agenda and then either maintaining reforming or blocking the agenda. So basically modifying the scope or the application of an agenda item once it's set. The second pathway of solution brokering is where elected members can employ creativity to diagnose problems and develop responses to address or resolve those problems. And this generally requires them, to be creative, as I've said, but think outside the box in order to create new mechanisms that might deliver solutions. Or alternatively, solution brokering might involve using existing mechanisms but in a new way to try and sort of shake up what's going on. And the third one of outcome shaping is pretty, I guess it kind of speaks for itself. And in the Security Council, the most common outcomes are a resolution. So if an elected member has made a critical contribution to a Security Council resolution, then that can be seen as a pathway of influence.
So I think this is incredibly useful for Australia, given that they are seeking to be elected, in terms of a framework that then the government could, if they wish, draw on to try and maximise their influence as E10. So, although you've been doing this work for some time now, it's incredibly timely, and I think that's one of the comments you got at the workshop. But, of course, before Australia can influence as an elected member, it has to get elected in the first place. And so one of the things that we were talking about at the workshop was Australia's potential slogan for its campaign to be elected. And there were quite a few ones suggested on the day, some more serious than others. The one that I contributed was taking advantage of our status as down under, saying Australia for when the world's gone upside down. Did you have a favourite slogan in terms of Australia's election campaign?
Well, I think we were asked to identify slogans as part of our papers. And I recalled the slogans that Australia did use last time around in 2013, 2014. Mm-hmm. And so one of those, it featured on, so as part of its campaign for election at that time, Australia shared with diplomats basically a really beautiful suite of gifts, and part of that gift was a beautiful moleskin journal, not the little ones that go in your pocket, which are beautiful enough, but a bigger one, a meaty sized journal, and it had a gorgeous indigenous looking representation of a kangaroo. So it was kind of like a classy version of a Qantas, the tail of a Qantas plane, and when you open these moleskins, so they had the plastic wrapper on the outside, and inside they have that little paper strip that comes around in the middle of the journal, and that strip said, Australia candidate for Security Council 2013-2014, and the slogan it had there was, Australia, we do what we say. So that's an example of one of the past slogans. Another, which you'll find on the internet if you go Googling what was our slogan at that time, is making a difference for the small and medium countries of the world. So, I mean, it's a nice sentiment, but perhaps just a little bit clunky. In terms of what I would say the slogan should be, that is a question without notice. I don't have a snappy response, but there were various ideas that came through during the workshop, and I think the one that I floated, which I don't necessarily think should be Australia's slogan or is necessarily the best, but it came in response to a question around how do we plan for our membership in 29-30, given the chaos in the world and the disorder and the disagreement between the permanent members at the moment. And so there was a sense that perhaps being an elected member on the council at this time, and things may change by then, would be extremely difficult. And I guess the point that I sought to make, which is feedback that we received when we were sharing our framework with elected members in 2023, in a workshop or a round table that was held at the Australian Mission to the UN in New York. And there were about 30 diplomats around the table, and some of them were from elected members that were on the council at the time. Others had just recently left, so they were called outgoing members, and others were incoming, so they'd been elected, but they were about to take their seat on the council. I think it was December we held this round table, so the next month they're about to step into the council. And we presented the framework, and we put the question to the members, the elected members that were sitting around the council. Does this framework still hold water at this time, given this is in late 2023, given the disruptions that had been experienced with the pandemic, and also with Russia's escalation of its intervention and the start of the war with Ukraine in 2022. Was there still scope for elected member influence in these challenging times? And the response we had, the overwhelming response from these diplomats who had been in the council through these moments, was that we actually have more capacity to make a difference now and to exercise influence, precisely because the permanent members are so divided. So in a sense, traditionally, the P5, when I say traditionally, sorry, I mean in the post-Cold War era, traditionally the P5 would really dominate the decision-making of the council. What would happen is the P3, which traditionally was the US, UK and France, would get together and decide what they thought was the best thing to happen on a given issue. So early drafts of a resolution would effectively be drafted by those three. They'd be broadened out to the P5, so to Russia and China, and so there'd be some differences made. And often this text was just presented to the E10, and they had little to no scope to modify that text, because they were told this is agreed in the P5. If there are any changes, we risk having a veto. So the E10 had, in that context, the margin for exercising influence, which we've through our project we've identified areas where elected members did still exercise influence, but the margin or the scope was much narrower. And so this feedback we were getting in 2023 was that effectively difficult times create opportunities for the elected members. So the slogan that I sort of frivolously shared with the table was chaos breeds opportunity.
I have to say, I think your frivolous slogan is a lot more thoughtful and considered than some of the ones that myself and my fellow co-hosts were coming up with at the time. I was just thinking with your talk of influencer, maybe it's Australia, influencer of the future.
Yes, okay.
So you've had a weekend now post the workshop to recover and to reflect and to think about what was a fantastic day. So do you have any final reflections on either the workshop itself or the future of the Security Council, just small issues like that?
Oh, wow. Well, I think my focus at the moment is just, how do we get these papers from the contributors? Because, it was a really terrific day. It was so stimulating and provocative and, I guess, reassuring as well in various ways. It was just getting really great people with fantastic experience and innovative ideas around a table. One of the things that I was struck by was the number of people who came and spent the whole day there with us, including very senior practitioners. And I think that itself reflected the quality of the discussions and how engaged people were in the day. And that's absolutely wonderful, and that in and of itself is enough for me as a workshop organiser. But given that we were tasked to do this by the Australian New Book of International Law with an eye to a groundbreaking special edition focused on these issues, it's really my mind at the moment. I'm still very anxious that the job's not done. In fact, I don't know what percentage of the job is done, but to get these papers out will be terrific, and then that in turn, hopefully, we'll be able to provide an intellectual base which is practically grounded to make a contribution to Australia's thinking in terms of how we approach the next term and what are our key priorities and what's possible and how do we go about making the possible actual.
So any contributors listening, please get your papers to Jeremy if you haven't already. I think what struck me on the day is I often get accused as being the optimist of the podcast, that when international law is falling down around us, I'm the one saying there is still value in the system, it's not that bad. But perhaps because of that tendency, I really was struck by a sense of hope in the room. I don't think anyone was being Pollyanna-ish or naive. There was a realisation and a recognition that the system is facing absolutely significant challenges, but nonetheless there was a impulse to still try and engage with it, to still try and make it better, to still do what we could do, both as academics and practitioners, to bring out what was still working in the system and try and change what wasn't. So I think for me that was really heartening to see.
Yeah, at least save the furniture. Huh?
Exactly.
I mean, there's one other thing I wanted to say,
Yeah.
Imogen, which you touched on in terms of we are technically campaigning for a seat, but at the moment it's uncontested, which has been very rare in the grouping that we're in, which is Western Europe and other group. I can't remember the last time there was and maybe I haven't been paying particularly close attention to this, but to me it's a surprise that it's uncontested, because generally these two WEOG seats, they come up every 2 years and they're highly contested. There's always at least 3 candidates contesting. The last time Australia was a candidate for 2013, 2014, it was really hotly contested, and it was a massive achievement to be, to get that seat before the others. At the moment, there's just 2 contestants at this time, and if that continues to be the case, then Australia won't even have to campaign. Although, as some of the contributors around the table who are practitioners representing key players in terms of Australia's representation on the council said, it would be really embarrassing not to get a resounding resounding vote if there are only two people. So it's still necessary to go around and convince countries that we need their vote. And also I have heard that there is a fear that so the elections for the seats on the council take place in June each year, and then the successful candidates then come onto the council the following year. And so the next election, so for the 2 WEOG members that would precede Australia, is taking place in June, and there are 3 countries competing. And I have heard the fear expressed that whoever misses out might decide to contest.
Sure, yeah.
Which I think might not be strategically advisable, but I could understand why they might consider doing that. So yeah, it's not a slam dunk yet by any means.
Well, we hope they do campaign, otherwise we won't get the merch.
Yeah, that's true. It'll be fascinating to see what needs to be a short slogan to fit on that moleskin.
Exactly. Well, Jeremy, before I let you go, we do have one traditional non-law question that we ask our guests. And our question for this season is, what do you do to switch off from international law? What do you read or watch or listen to or participate in that lets you get your mind away from it and engage with something that's not all about international law all the time?
It's a big challenge in this day and age, isn't it? I mean, we're just so inundated by outrageous developments which really challenge our sensibilities as international lawyers. Yeah, I guess, I mean, at the moment, it's probably dog walking, I'd say. We've got a 3-year-old, extremely energetic and active golden retriever called Bruni, and she needs to be exercised a lot. So for me, I think that's when I get to switch off, is just walking Bruni on the ridge, so on the hills around Canberra.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jeremy.
Thank you, Imogen. Thank you, everyone.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm William Maley, and I'm Emeritus Professor of Diplomacy at the Australian National University.
And I'm Richard Rowe, and I'm an Honorary Professor at the ANU Law School.
Thank you. And what was the title of your presentation today?
It was a comparative analysis of Australia's 5 terms as a non-permanent member of the Security Council.
And mine was on Australia and the Security Council, some historical reflections.
Wonderful. And what was the main argument in summary form?
The main argument is that Australia's engagement with the Security Council comes in the context of rather a long history of ideas about international organisation, experience through the League of Nations, and then direct engagement, particularly at the San Francisco conference, which finalised the draft of the Charter.
Yes.
And Australia has made a contribution to the UN Security Council over 5 terms. That derives very much from the very responsible approach which Australia takes to its membership of the United Nations and its desire to be elected as a non-permanent member to the Council periodically to pursue global interests and to, above all, to support Article 24 of the United Nations Charter and to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security.
Yes, you were actually both asked to give a little catchphrase, as it were, to begin your presentations. Could you share those with our listeners?
Yes, well, mine was honour the trust, because I feel that's been absolutely integral to Australia's approach to its membership as a non-permanent member of the Security Council over those 5 terms. And by that I mean that it honours the trust which the membership of the United Nations has bestowed upon Australia to ensure that Article 24 and the powers and functions and responsibility of the Security Council are adhered to.
And mine was Dante's observation, abandon hope all ye who enter here, partly inspired by Hammarskjöld's observation that the role of the United Nations was not to take us to heaven but to stop us from going to hell. It's quite appropriate, I think, to have realistic rather than utopian expectations of what international political organisation can deliver.
Fair enough. And now we have a wonderful room of people with us today. We are operating under Chatham House rules, so we can't reveal everything. But what did you think was the most interesting or useful piece of feedback or discussion that followed your presentation?
I think the most interesting part of the discussion really was reflections on how states can both successfully campaign for non-permanent seats within the Security Council and how they can then optimise their use of non-permanent seats in the Security Council in an environment in which the permanent 5 members with the veto power often seem to be dominant.
Yes, yeah.
And I would say that the dual aspect of the possibility that Australia has through its membership as a non-permanent member of operating within the Council, but also the importance which Australia attaches outside the Council to pursuing its interests and working with other states, even when it's not actually a member of the Council. That's a very important diplomatic role that Australia attaches importance to.
Yes, and I had a question, and I'm exploiting my role as interviewer here. I was very interested in both of your presentations that there seemed to be a certain parallel, and indeed in the other presentations on the same panel, how much it all comes down to individuals at the end of the day and to relationships and personalities. It seems like a somewhat fragile hook on which to hang our diplomatic future, but how important is it really, these individual people who are, to quote Hamilton, in the room when it happens?
I think it's very important. Henry Kissinger, when he became National Security Advisor in the United States, remarked that the big change in his thinking from when he'd been a professor of government at Harvard was an appreciation of how much more personalities mattered than he had understood from his academic career. And of course, a lot of writing in international relations is concerned with structures of international society. But diplomatic historians often emphasise the contingent consequences of particular interactions between individuals. And I think it is important to understand that when we're looking at organisations like the UN.
Yeah, indeed. Richard?
Yes, and I think absolutely a critical part of diplomatic tradecraft is to build relationships that are relationships of trust, relationships between people, so that you can maximise your interests in talking to them and get support for those, and not always successfully, of course, but if you have a good personal relationship with your interlocutors, you have a better chance of being given a good hearing.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Thank you so much. And now, of course, our final question. We're talking about a very serious topic today. Our listeners love to know what it is that you do to take your mind off international law in your relaxation times.
I play golf, which is a source of post-traumatic stress disorder.
I think my co-host Tamsin would agree with you there. Yes.
And I am a tennis tragic. I play lots of tennis several times a week.
Excellent. We're very pro-exercise here on the pod. Thank you so much.
All right, and we're here at the Australian Yearbook of International Law workshop on 80 years of Australia and the UN Security Council, and I'm speaking with Shirley Scott and Sue Harris. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Shirley. Could you tell us? Sorry, could you introduce yourself briefly, as in your name, title, job?
Sure, thanks Douglas. I'm Shirley Scott. I'm a Professor of International Law and International Relations at UNSW Canberra.
Fabulous. And what was the title of your paper today?
It was Australia, Climate Change and the UN Security Council.
Mm-hmm. And what was the principal argument you were making?
Well, it's my view that if the current structures of global governance stay as they are, then at some point the UN Security Council is going to have to take a very decisive response to the climate crisis.
Yeah, I thought your point that maybe there's no other alternative was really interesting. Was there any feedback you got through questions today that you thought were particularly interesting, or any related points made by other papers that you found particularly interesting?
Well, Sue, her input very much dovetailed with mine. I guess when it came to the questions and the suggestion I felt from many was that it's not likely, what I see as inevitable, but from my perspective there's still questions within the current paradigm, whereas at some point, just as there could be a tipping point in the natural world from climate change, so there may be a governance tipping point. So actually I don't feel that they took away from my basic point.
Well, a lot of fairly improbable things have come to pass in the era of the Trump presidency, including the Trump presidency, in fact 2 of them. But anyway,
it's true.
Sue, I'll pass to you. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer from Griffith Law School in Brisbane.
Terrific. And what was the title of your paper?
It was Non-Traditional Security Threats and the Climate Nexus, Conflict Climate Nexus.
And
It's not a cool title, is it?
Well,
I should have thought about that a little harder.
at least you both avoided the, either the terrible pun or the literary quote school of conference papers. And what was the principal argument you were making, Sue?
So the Security Council has really struggled with non-traditional security threats, or this human security framing. So they're very much in this traditional security framing of what is a threat to international peace and security is one state in armed conflict with another state in a way that involves very traditional types of violence. And they haven't really been able to deal with a whole range of other things, even though they've been challenged many, many times by electoral violence, organised crime, and so forth. And so I, like Shirley, driven by the evidence of the impacts of climate change that are beautifully mapped out in IPCC 6th Assessment Report, for example, I just think they will have to understand that this gatekeeping around this issue cannot continue, because it's just intellectually not honest to what's going to be the lived reality of people. But there was a really pivotal moment where Russia just vetoed this new climate, peace and security agenda. So we could have had we could have at least had a thematic agenda that could have started the thinking rolling, and Russia vetoed it in 2021. So from then on it's been a fat mess, basically. You heard it here first. It's a fat mess.
Outstanding. And was there any feedback you got in the panel, or any points made in other papers that particularly chimed with you, or you found particularly interesting?
Well, I mean, I agree with Shirley. The tricky part is, what would they do? What can they do? What should they do? I don't like the securitisation of issues that aren't security issues generally. So, migration. So one of the things I hate about the Security Council is they use refugee flows as a trigger for saying that refugees are a burden and a destabilising influence on neighbouring countries, and I don't like that framing, right? So I could see there's a lot of danger in the way that climate could be securitised in ways that we don't like militaries should control what's going on in a climate emergency, and I don't want that. It's not what feminist approaches to international law would say is a good outcome. So we got a lot of really interesting ideas about, well, is it likely and what could they effectively do? But what I enjoyed the feedback on this idea that armies, our defence forces, are already being pushed in all these non-traditional threat ways already. This is sort of happening. And the Australian Defence Force has been called out so many times now in the last 10 years. So the Navy's already trying to disrupt people in boats, maritime arrivals. Then they've been doing that for decades now, even though they're not traditional threats. They're not threats of any kind. And then the army has been called into floods, bushfires, and also COVID responses. And some of these have been, I guess, more successful in terms of their social licence, like particularly the Malakuta evacuation. That's now used on all their recruitment advertising to join the ADF, you've probably noticed. But most of the others have not been crowned in glory. You know, the military were not the appropriate people to lead the COVID response. That was a really weird call out of the aid to the civil power. So they're very conflicted inside, and I think we as civil society should be quite conflicted outside.
And our final question, because talking about international affairs in the current age tends to get a bit grim and dark, and we all need a degree of relief. What do you do to take your mind off the state of the world?
I'm a fanatical fan of RuPaul's Drag Race. I would like to say it's because I'm a gender scholar and I, think critically about, gender identities, but actually I just really like drag as an art form. I just like the frocks. I really, really like it. It's really, really funny.
Excellent. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us on Call to the Bar.
Thanks. Thanks, Douglas.
Hello, this is Imogen Saunders coming to you from the ANU's workshop on Australia and the UN Security Council, 80 years and counting. And I'm here with Professor Devika Hovell from the London School of Economics. Now, Devika, as well as being at the workshop today and being one of the workshop organisers, you also gave the Kirby Lecture in International Law last night, the 18th iteration of that lecture, to a sold-out crowd on the topic of disarmament. Would you be able to tell us briefly, distill your 40-minute lecture into a minute or two for the pod?
I will give it my best shot. So my focus was more on the bomb, capital T, capital B, rather than disarmament more generally. And I was obviously inspired by the fact that the bomb has been relevant, not least in unilateral attempts to disarm Iran, but also the idea that there's a rearmament going on. So my interest in particular was about the bomb as a distinctive weapon, not only because it is uniquely catastrophic, although it is. My interest was more in that, despite, for an object bent on world annihilation and destruction of the planet's ecosystem, the bomb has quite a good name. It's credited with winning a world war. It's starred in many movies. It won an Oscar. And the reason for that is the second sense in which it's distinctive, and that connects to the fact that it is responsible or seen in some way as constitutive of world order. So I'm interested really in the bomb as constitutional artefact, and the lecture was very much focused on interrogating that. So I looked, at the structure as it's developed through conventions, the NPT, through, of course, the famous or infamous advisory opinion from the ICJ. And in that sense, saw that, or looked at the way in which the constitutional status of the bomb is kind of incoherent. It's seen, on the one hand as a horror to be prohibited, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, on the other as a danger to be managed, but on the other as a privilege of a certain few through the NPT and the 5 nuclear states. And I looked at in the lecture really the two ways in which this is legally mandated. So, to try and be brief, and too late for that, you might say, but basically there were two arguments. The first, and that basically this constitutional structure shelters under two main principles. The first is the principle of self-defence, and the second is the principle of deterrence. And to cut a long story short, I conclude that really what we have, if we interrogate those structures, the bomber's right, the bomber's control, is a situation, and I use this metaphor of gods and monsters. The bomb as right really creates this regime of dominance, inequality, arbitrariness. The bomber's control, essentially a governance built on fear. And so we have, instead of a constitutional regime, really more like an oligarchic management built on, by definition, a balance of terror.
Thank you very much. And I should say for our listeners that the full lecture was recorded and it will be available. And I believe, and I hope I'm not throwing Devika under the bus here, I believe it might also be published in an upcoming edition of the Australian Yearbook of International Law in written form. But one of the things I'll just say to add to it that I found so striking, because, the bomb is talked about as the end of World War II. But as you pointed out, it's actually more era-defining than that. It was not only the end of World War II, but it was the beginning of the Cold War. And so it wasn't just something that ended conflict, but started a new type of conflict and governs the world we live in today.
Indeed, and a new type of world order, where one might argue still in that Cold War.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we are going to have to run back to the workshop, but before we go, I just want to ask you our final non-law question. Devika, you're an incredible international lawyer, you're incredibly prolific, you write on a range of areas, but what do you do to take your mind off international law? What do you do to unwind, relax, do anything else?
Could I just flip that? I have teenage children. So actually, for me, war and atrocity is a way to take my mind off the battle of the teenagers.
We finally found our upside of it. Thank you very much, Devika.
Thanks.